She was mocked for her weight until the cowboy asked, "Will you be my wife?" But before that proposal, do you know how many years of rejection,
What's she
humiliation, and
worth?
loneliness Clara had to endure? A
I'd
50-year-old
say
woman
whole pigs
who
a
thought that her
runt.
whole life would be filled with contemptuous looks. So what happened
If
to turn
they
the tragedy
only
into a moment
knew
that silenced the whole
what it
town?
took
And
to
then after taking
still
that
be
hand, where will
standing.
Clara's life go? Dry Creek was the kind of town where dust lingered in every crack of wood, and gossip clung even longer. At the autumn fair, laughter spilled louder than fiddles, sharper than the smell of whiskey in the air. Men leaned on fence rails, women huddled near the pie stalls, and children darted like sparrows. But beneath all that noise, Clara walked alone. She was 50 years old, broad in frame, soft in middle, her dress plain but carefully mended. The years had written their stories into her face creases around her mouth, from both sorrow and endurance, silver threading through the braids she wound tight each morning. Some people saw her body first and never looked further. To them, she was too much, and because of that, they decided she was not enough. Ezra Pike, loud as always, leaned against the pig pen. His voice carried like a crow's call. "Careful, boys. Don't let the hogs mistake her for one of their own." The men around him snorted into their mugs. Boots scraped dirt. Someone muttered "obese bride," and the phrase stuck in the air like tar. Clara kept her pace steady. She had learned long ago that to flinch was to feed them. Inside, though, the words pressed down like stones in her chest. Her whole life, people had tried to measure her worth in pounds instead of kindness, in appearances instead of endurance. Yet she never allowed their mockery to decide who she was. At the edge of the fairground, the creek shimmered. Cottonwoods bent over the water, their leaves whispering a language older than cruelty. Clara stopped there, resting her hands on the railing of the wooden bridge. She looked at her reflection, wider than the young girls in calico. Yes, slower in step, yes, but still standing, still present. "Keep breathing," she whispered to herself. "Keep standing." Behind her, a voice spoke, quiet, measured, not mocking. "Ma'am." She turned. A man stood a few paces away, hat in his hands, as though even the brim might come between them. Thomas, broad-shouldered, sun-worn, but with a stillness about him that felt like shelter. He didn't stare. He didn't sneer. He simply held her in his gaze, as though she were not invisible, not too much, but exactly enough to notice. "I'm sorry for what they said," he murmured. "It ain't the truth of you." Clara blinked. She hadn't heard such words in years. Not pity, pity has a sharp edge, but something gentler, like a cup of water, placed directly into waiting hands. She straightened her shawl. "Their talk doesn't change the weather." "No," Thomas said, voice low. "But it can change a day, and you deserve a good one." Something stirred in her chest, not hope exactly, but a loosening like a knot beginning to unthread. He tipped his hat and stepped back, giving her space as if to say he had no claim, only regard. The creek rippled. The cottonwoods sighed. That night in her rented room above the livery, Clara unpinned her hair and saw herself in the small cracked mirror. The face staring back was the same one she'd carried all her life, but now it carried a question. What if one voice of kindness could outweigh 1,000 whispers of scorn? Her heart answered softly, maybe. The next morning, Clara woke early, as she always did. Years of rising before dawn had trained her body, though her heart still carried the weight of restless nights. She folded her shawl, pinned her hair back, and went down to the square to fetch bread. The town was quieter, then hushed by the cool breath of sunrise. She felt the stairs before she saw them. Not cruel, not yet, but curious. There she goes. The woman too broad for marriage, too old for starting again. Clara bore them in silence, every step a prayer that her dignity would not crumble beneath their eyes. At the bakery door she hesitated. Then came a shadow falling across the dust at her feet. "Morning, ma'am," the voice said again. Steady, familiar. She looked up. It was Thomas, holding a small sack of flour under one arm, his other hand loose at his side. The hat was off again, tucked beneath his elbow, as though he considered it impolite to put a brim between his eyes and hers. "You're the man from yesterday," she said. He nodded, a half smile tugging at his mouth. "Thomas Hale. We crossed paths once years back. Flood along Willow Creek. Your father's barn near washed away. I was one of the ranch hands who helped pull cattle to higher ground." Memory stirred, slow but certain. Yes, there had been a boy then, tall already, quiet among the others who lifted beams without complaint. He hadn't spoken to her much, but she remembered how he'd carried her younger brother out of the rising water without waiting to be asked. "You," she whispered. "You were there." "I was." His gaze softened. "Didn't reckon you'd remember." "I remember everyone who didn't laugh." The words slipped out before she could stop them, heavier than she meant, but Thomas didn't flinch. He only nodded, as though he knew the shape of that truth already. For a moment the air between them was not filled with stares or whispers, but with the sound of wagons, rolling sparrows chattering on the roof beams. Just ordinary sounds, and that to Clara felt like a gift. He shifted the flour sack. "I could use some help at my place. Just small things. A garden that won't mind extra hands. A kitchen that could do with warmth. Only if you're willing." Clara blinked. Offers from men had rarely come without strings, without expectation of repayment, in ways she'd rather forget. But his tone carried no hunger, no pity, only respect, the kind that sees a person's worth in their being, not their bargaining. "I'm no hired cook," she said carefully. "I'm not hiring," he replied, gentle but firm. "I'm asking. No pay, just a table where you're welcome." She studied him then, the weathered lines, the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair, the eyes that didn't dart away when she met them. He wasn't young, wasn't polished, wasn't a man who lived on flattery. He was something else, solid. Her lips pressed together. She wanted to say yes, wanted to step into a place where she wasn't merely endured, but invited. But caution tugged at her. She had believed kindness before, only to watch it sour. Still, she nodded once. "I'll think on it." "That's all I ask," Thomas said, tipping his head. He stepped aside to let her pass into the bakery, his presence like a fence post in a storm, ordinary, but holding the world upright. That evening, back in her small rented room, Clara unfolded the bakery's paper wrap and broke bread alone. Yet the words lingered, filling the empty corners, "a table where you're welcome." And for the first time in years, she let herself wonder, what if welcome was real this time? What if she belonged, not because she proved herself, but simply because she stayed? The next Sunday, Clara walked to church with her shawl pulled tight. She hadn't gone in weeks, but something in her wanted to try again. Perhaps it was the memory of Thomas's steady gaze, or perhaps she was just tired of letting whispers keep her from worship. Inside the wooden chapel, sunlight streamed through dusty panes, settling on the pews like soft lace. Clara took her seat in the back, lowering her head in prayer. She thought if she sat quietly enough, she might blend into the silence. But whispers like nettles always find bare skin. That's her, the one who never married. They say her family traded her off once, but no man would keep her. She should have stayed home. Women like that don't belong where vows are spoken. The words slithered down the pews, some said aloud, others mouthed behind hands. Clara sat taller, refusing to shrink. But inside her ribs tightened. She had survived years of such talk, yet every time it returned, it tore open the same old wound, that she was too much and still never enough. When the service ended, she stepped out into the pale morning light. Her hands were trembling when she reached for the churchyard gate. That's when she heard it, "Miss Clara." Thomas stood there holding the reins of his horse. He wasn't dressed in finery, just his worn coat and boots dusted from the trail. But his presence made the laughter around her seem to thin. "You walk alone?" he asked. "I always have," she said, her voice sharper than she meant. His brow furrowed, not in offense, but in concern. "Then perhaps it's time you didn't." Clara froze. Around them, townsfolk lingered, their stares heavy as stones. She felt them waiting, eager for another spectacle. If she answered, if she even lingered near him, they would have fresh fuel for their gossip. "People talk," she whispered. "Let them," Thomas said. His voice was calm, almost steady enough to silence the air itself. "They've got nothing better to do. I've got land to tend a table that needs filling and a life that don't run on whispers." Her heart ached at his words. How simple he made it sound, like choosing where to stand on a quiet hill. But for Clara, it was never simple. Every cruel laugh, every mocking glance, every man who had looked her up and down and turned away, they lived inside her still. "I can't be your shame," she said quietly. "Not your burden." His eyes met hers. "You'd be neither. You'd be a woman at my table, no less and no more. That's all." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to take that step toward his steadiness. But the weight of years held her back. She turned away, clutching her shawl tighter, walking fast down the road as whispers stirred again behind her. That night in her rented room, she wept not loudly, but with the deep ache of someone who had carried too much for too long. She pressed her face into her pillow and asked herself the question she could never answer. What if kindness was just another kind of trap? And yet through her tears, another question surfaced, soft or stubborn. What if this time it wasn't? For 2 days after the churchyard, Clara kept her distance. She busied herself with sewing repairs for the widow she boarded, with her fingers pricked raw from the needle. She told herself it was safer this way. Silence, invisibility. That had always been her shield. But on the third morning, she found a loaf of bread on the step outside her door, still warm, wrapped in a piece of clean muslin. No note, no signature, just the quiet weight of an offering. She knew it was him. That evening when she passed the blacksmith's, she saw Thomas there, not waiting for her, not even looking her way. He was lifting a wagon wheel for an older man whose back bent too low to bear weight. Thomas set it in place, tightened the bolts, and only when the man pressed a coin into his hand did he shake his head and walk away. Clara stood in the shadow of the eaves, her throat thick. No performance, no boasting, just simple acts done because they needed doing. Later that week, she dared to visit his ranch. She told herself it was only curiosity, but her feet carried her past the cottonwood trees and up the path worn thin by boots and hooves. The house was plain, its paint faded, but the porch swept the fences, mended the garden rows neat. Everything bore the mark of care. She almost turned back when the door opened. Clara Thomas said, surprised but not startled. He stepped aside. "Would you come in?" Her instinct screamed no, for every time she had entered a man's space before it had ended in debt she could never repay. But the air here was different. The smell of coffee and wood smoke, the low creak of a rocking chair by the fire. No sharp edges, no cages. She stepped inside. On the table sat 2 mugs, steam curling from each. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said simply. "You expected me, I hoped." They sat. Silence stretched, but it was not heavy. For once, silence felt like rest. Clara wrapped her hands around the warm mug, letting it seep into her chilled fingers. "You'll catch talk letting me in here," she murmured. "Talk don't fix fences, don't plant seed, don't keep a man warm at night." He looked at her, then steady as always. "I don't build my life on what other folks whisper." Her lips trembled, caught between disbelief and longing. "And if they laugh, let 'em," he said. "I'll be too busy living." Something in Clara broke then, not in pain but in release. She felt her shoulders drop, as though the years of bracing against the world's judgment had grown too heavy to carry one more step. For the first time in decades, she let out a small laugh, fragile but real. And when Thomas heard it, his eyes softened in a way that told her he'd been waiting not for a pretty smile, but for this proof that her spirit still lived. That night, as she walked home beneath a rising moon, Clara no longer heard the whispers of the town in her head. She only heard his words, "I'll be too busy living." For the first time in years, she wondered if she could too. The warmth from that evening at Thomas's table lingered with Clara like an ember. Yet embers, when stirred, can bring up ashes too. 2 weeks passed, and she began to visit his ranch more often. At first, she brought mended shirts, loaves of bread, excuses wrapped in usefulness. But as the days softened, there was less excuse and more presence. Sometimes they spoke of weather or calves or planting season. Sometimes they said little at all. But beneath her steady voice, Clara wrestled. What if he only pitied me? What if one day he too turns away? The question gnawed like a wolf at the edges of her peace. It came to a head one afternoon when she entered the general store. A pair of women stood by the sugar barrels, their words sharp as barbed wire. "Imagine him," one said, "a man like Thomas Boone taking up with a woman like her." "Lonely makes men foolish," the other laughed. "She's lucky he's kind. But it won't last. Men don't stay with women built like barns." Clara froze, her chest aching with the familiar cut of humiliation. She turned to leave, but Thomas was at the doorway. He had heard. His jaw tightened, not in shame, but in fury. "Enough," he said, his voice firm but quiet. The women blinked, startled. "You'd speak of her like she ain't worth the air in this room. Then you don't deserve the bread she bakes, nor the strength she carries." The women flushed, muttered, and left in haste. Clara stood rooted. Heat flushed her cheeks, but it wasn't only shame. It was the terrifying relief of being defended. No man had ever done that for her, not once in 50 years. Outside, she caught her breath. You shouldn't have. I should have, he interrupted. And I will again. Her eyes brimmed. But Thomas, they're not wrong. I've been mocked my whole life, traded once like livestock, left standing at a church door while laughter followed me down the street. I can't pretend those scars aren't there. Thomas's gaze softened the steel in his jaw, bending into sorrow. He removed his hat, running a hand through graying hair. Then maybe it's time I told you mine. You think I don't know shame? I was a husband once, a father, until fever took them both in one cruel week. Folks said it was my fault I didn't call the doctor soon enough, didn't pray hard enough, didn't deserve to keep them. You think whispers only follow you, Clara? They've carved me hollow too. Silence swelled between them, heavy, tender. Clara reached for the porch rail to steady herself. His grief lay bare before her, raw as her own. And in that moment she realized the truth: they were both carrying ruins. Her voice trembled. So what do we do with all this brokenness? Thomas stepped closer, his hand rough and hesitant as it reached for hers. Maybe, he said, we set it down together. For the first time, Clara didn't pull away. She let his hand cover hers, warm and steady, and though the past still loomed, the weight of it seemed for once shared. That night, Clara lay awake staring at the rafters. Her heart ached, but not only with fear. For the first time in years, it ached with possibility. The whispers did not stop. If anything, they grew louder after Thomas defended Clara at the store. Men raised eyebrows, women turned their backs. A few boys on the street even mocked her walk, stomping wide-legged and laughing until their mothers dragged them away. In years past, Clara would have lowered her head, hurried home, and folded herself smaller. Silence had always been her armor, but this time something was different. This time she wasn't standing alone. On Sunday morning, she entered the churchyard with Thomas at her side. The congregation fell into a hush, some out of respect, others from spite. Clara's heart pounded, her palms damp against her gloves. She nearly faltered at the steps, but Thomas leaned close. Breathe, he whispered. We don't owe them shame. Inside, pews creaked as people turned to watch. Clara's instinct told her to sit in the far back, but Thomas guided her to the third row, right in the center where every whisper had to face her. When the hymn began, Clara's voice trembled on the first line. She hadn't sung in years, not since her father's hand forced her to marry, not since a crowd once laughed at her in a wedding dress. But as the notes rose around her, something in her chest loosened. By the second verse, she sang steady, not loud but sure. Thomas's voice joined hers, low and rough, and for the first time Clara felt that her voice belonged, woven into the fabric of sound, not hidden away. After service, an old ranch hand approached. Miss Clara, he said, awkward, tugging his hat. That bread you gave my wife last week, it helped more than you know. Thank you. The words stunned her. Gratitude. Not pity, not mockery. Real thanks. She swallowed, nodded, whispered, You're welcome. And in that moment she realized whispers can wound, yes, but kindness when spoken can heal deeper. That evening, as the sun dropped behind cottonwoods, Clara sat on Thomas's porch. She stared at the horizon, the light gilding her face. I never thought I'd see the day I could walk into that church without bowing my head, she said softly. Thomas leaned back in his chair, arms folded, gaze steady on her. That's because you forgot what I see every day. You've been strong so long, Clara. You don't even notice it anymore. Her throat tightened. Do you really think so? I know so. He leaned forward, voice gentler. You've carried shame that wasn't yours. You've carried silence that broke your back. But you're still standing, and I reckon that's worth more than any gold this land could dig up. Her eyes filled, but this time the tears didn't burn. They washed. They cleansed. She let them fall unashamed. For the first time, Clara felt the walls she had built around herself crack, not in collapse but in release. The air seemed lighter, the world less cruel. For the first time she thought, perhaps I can stay. Perhaps I can be loved. The prairie wind stirred soft against her cheek. Beside her, Thomas reached for her hand again, and this time Clara held on first. Winter gave way to spring, and with it came a quiet shift. Where once Clara hurried through town with eyes lowered, she now walked with her chin lifted, her shawl tied firm across her shoulders, her steps steady. Some still whispered, but their voices no longer bound her. The cruel words fell behind like dry leaves scattered by wind. One April morning, Thomas stopped his wagon in front of her small cabin. The twins from her late sister were playing in the yard, chasing each other with wild laughter. Clara stepped out, apron dusted with flour, and looked at him curiously. He climbed down, holding something small in his palm. Not a ring, not flowers, not a trinket of courtship. Instead, he offered a brass key, simple, worn, with the weight of use. "I don't have speeches, Clara," he said, voice rough, "and I don't care what the town thinks. But this key, it's to my home. I don't want it to be just mine anymore. Will you make it ours?" Clara's hand trembled as she took the key. No man had ever asked her not truly, not freely, not with dignity. She closed her fingers around it, the metal warm from his palm. "Are you certain?" she whispered. "I come with scars, with a body they call too much, with a life worn thin." Thomas stepped closer, his eyes steady. "Then I'll take it all, because it's you, and you are worth more than gold." Her tears spilled soft and quiet, but she didn't hide them. The children clapped in delight, not understanding fully, but knowing joy when they saw it. And Clara, for the first time in 50 years, let herself believe in joy. That night, she moved her shawl to the Boone Ranch. She hung it on the same peg as his weathered coat. The sight of them side by side made her chest swell with something long absent belonging. In the weeks that followed, Clara's laughter began to return, hesitant at first, then truer. She baked bread not just for survival, but for sharing. She sang hymns not as duty, but as prayer. And when Thomas reached for her hand across the supper table, she no longer questioned if she deserved it. She simply held on. One evening, as dusk painted the prairie with rose light, Thomas leaned beside her on the porch. The air smelled of lilac and turned earth. "You ever think," Clara said softly, "that maybe love doesn't come late at all? Maybe it just comes when we're finally ready to see it?" Thomas smiled, lines deepening around his eyes. "I reckon you're right. And I reckon I've been waiting my whole life to see you." She laid her head on his shoulder, the horizon stretching endless before them, the future no longer something to fear, but something to walk into together. For Clara, the mocking voices of the past would never fully vanish, but they no longer defined her. What defined her now was the strength to stay, the courage to hope, and the quiet, steadfast hand of a man who chose her for exactly who she was. At last, the girl once traded, shamed, and overlooked had become the woman chosen, cherished, and loved. And that love, hard-won, late-bloomed, but true, was the kind that endures. In the end, Clara's story is not just about being mocked for her weight or overlooked for her years. It is about the quiet strength of a woman who refused to let shame define her. For 50 years, she carried the sting of rejection, yet she chose kindness, chose dignity, chose to keep walking with her head held high. And then, when the world least expected it, love found her. Not the love that flatters or hides, but the kind that looks at you and says, "Exactly as you are enough." When Thomas reached out his hand in front of everyone, it wasn't just a proposal. It was a declaration that sometimes the most beautiful hearts are the ones the world tried hardest to dismiss. Friends, maybe you have lived with your own whispers of doubt. Maybe people have called you too much or not enough. Clara's story reminds us that love, dignity, and belonging are never out of reach. It may come later in life, it may come gently, but when it comes, it heals. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to subscribe to None. Wild West Saga for more tales of quiet courage, second chances, and love that arrives just in time. And tell us in the comments, would you like to see what happens next for Clara and Thomas? Or hear more stories of women and men who found love when the world had given up on them? Your words matter, and we read everyone.